Good morning. This is now the sixth of these Bible studies on John's Gospel. We're not travelling very fast, but I'm sure there's lessons we can be learning as we're going along. When you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, what you find simply is that they set out a time frame almost like a diary that passes from one stage to another. John, as I've said before, is not that interested in that. He just wants to express the important things about Jesus' life and ministry, that people will be able to understand who he was, what he had done, and why he had done it. So having told people about Jesus' first miracle, which had taken place in Cana, where he had turned the water into wine, he then says quite simply at the end of that, Jesus went back to Capernaum, and there he did other things and carried other miracles, and he spoke in other ways. But then he comes back because he wants to emphasize another important aspect of Jesus' ministry. And he says quite simply, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, many evangelicals have a great difficulty with this because John is almost assuming that this is taking place at the beginning of his ministry, whereas, of course, the other evangelists put this right towards the end of his ministry, after the ride into Jerusalem on the donkey. And I have a feeling that is when it actually took place. But John wants to emphasize something very special about Jesus' ministry, and having spoken about changing water into wine, where he can take our purified lives and change them into the wine of the kingdom, he wants to now show us Jesus' relationship with the temple and all that it stood for. And he says quite simply on this occasion that Jesus went into the temple courts. Now, when the people gathered in Jerusalem, they came to offer sacrifice. And one of the instructions they were given simply is that the sacrifice they offered had to be a pure sacrifice. It couldn't be contaminated in any way. Now, to be sure that the animals offered in sacrifice were pure, they had to be passed by the priests in the temple and examined by the priests in the temple. And so the people coming up to Jerusalem would bring with them their money to purchase an animal sacrifice, and they had to purchase it from the temple authorities. Now, it's a little bit worse than that, because when they came to the temple, they were not allowed to take their coins, their money, into the temple precincts. Why? Because the coins had the image of Caesar on it. So they had to change their money into temple money before they could buy the sacrifice. And in all of these exchanges, well, they were making profit at any point. If they could only buy an animal which had been put up by the priests as being perfect, and they could only use coins used in the temple, then the priest was making money at every level as they exchanged the money and then sold these animals. It was known as the Bazaar of Annas. Jesus knows about it. He's been there every year. He was going up with his parents as a child for the great feasts. He'd been going into the temple right throughout his ministry and seeing this happening. He had ignored it and left it alone. He'd left it alone until after he had ridden that donkey down from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. At that point, he had laid down a special claim, and that claim was that he was the Messiah. And as a result, he could therefore take authority over the temple and what went on in the temple. And going into the temple precincts, into this bazaar of Annas, he found people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging the money. So he made a whip out of different cords and drove them out of the temple courts. Both sheep and cattle, he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market." It says, his disciples, "Remember that it is written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.'" This is one of the prophecies of the Messiah. "Zeal for your house will consume me." The authorities were astounded. They could not understand. They went to him and they said, "Who gave you this authority to act in this way? Can you show us any proof that you have this authority?" They knew he'd ridden the donkey. They knew he'd claimed to be the Messiah by riding a donkey. But now, once again, they're asking for a sign, a special sign. They say, "Give us a special sign that we can prove to us that you have this authority to come into these temple precincts and do these things." Now, what we have to remember, there were literally crowds of people around. They'd come up for the feast. They were getting ready for the feast. And the high priest and the Roman authorities were always very worried on these occasions that a riot would start. A riot which would encompass not just the temple, but the whole city. That the Romans would have to release their soldiers to put down the riot. And it could be the start of a great rebellion. So they're very worried by what he's doing. So they say, show us some sign that you are truly the Messiah and you have this type of authority. And Jesus turns to them and he says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it up again in 3 days." Well, they looked around at all these, the work that had been going on. It had been in process of building now. It wasn't completed. It was in the process of building, and the process had been going on for 46 years. They've been building this temple for 46 years. And they said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're saying to us, knock it down, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days?" Of course, they'd asked for a sign, and the sign that Jesus said he was going to give them was not the physical temple that they were looking at. It was, in fact, himself. Because what he was saying simply was, you destroy this temple, that's me. You put me to death. You put me to death. And I will raise it up again in 3 days. But they didn't quite understand him. But after he was raised from the dead, his disciples realized what he'd been saying and what he'd been trying to show to the people who were there. He was saying to them quite simply, when you turn against me, when you hand me over for crucifixion, when you put down this particular temple, this body in which I'm living, this body which is part of me, and lay me in the grave, I will raise it up again 3 days later. So Jesus was claiming authority, not just over the natural temple, but he was also setting up this great sign that the people would hear about and try to understand. It must have been a great shock to them, something which they found difficult to come to understand. But then he goes on from that, because having gone from the temple grounds, suddenly some of the leaders of Judaism come to him, and we're told it's the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel now. They come to him by night, Nicodemus. Now he too was interested in what Jesus was saying and doing, and that's why I'm sure this was at the end of Jesus' ministry, not at the beginning. And Nicodemus comes to him, he says, we know that you must come from God by the signs that you're doing. And Jesus stops him. He says, "Stop, Nicodemus, you've got it wrong. You've got it wrong. You are trying to prove who I am by watching what I'm doing and trying to understand it with your human mind. He said, if you really want to see the kingdom, you have to be born again, because your physical eyes and your physical ears are not going to be able to show you what the kingdom is all about. See, we're given 5 senses, and with these 5 senses, we observe the world in which we're living. Our brain creates a sort of picture for us of the world with which we are surrounded. We see things, we hear things, we smell things, we touch things, we taste things. We have the world around us, and we observe that world through the senses that we are given. Jesus says to Nicodemus, he says, you need the 6th sense. The 5 senses are not going to be good enough. You need to be able to see the kingdom with the Spirit. You need to be able to see with the Spirit's eyes. Then you will hear the words I'm speaking and you'll understand them. Then you will see the signs I'm doing and understand them. The others are seeing things and they are hearing things, but they just can't understand it. That's why they keep asking me for a sign. But even if I gave them this sign, they wouldn't believe it. And it was true, because when Jesus finally rose from the dead, and when those soldiers who'd been out on guard outside of the grave rush in and tell the priests, guess what happened? The stone was rolled away, and he came out. They said to them, now, we're going to give you a sum of money. And what you will say is his followers came by night, rolled the stone away, and stole the body. You can say, if you like, you fell asleep, and we'll stand up against Pilate, and we'll explain to him that you're not to be punished. You are to be, if you tell this lie, then this lie we will support you with. See, even when they saw that Jesus was risen from the dead, even when he proved to them that this had happened, the thing that he had prophesied, even when he was cleansing the temple, even when this happened, they would not believe. In fact, Jesus often tells another story. He tells a story of a rich man and Lazarus sitting by his gate. And he said they both die. And the rich man looks up and sees his Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And he says to him, can Lazarus come and give me a drop of water? And Abraham says, no, we can't communicate between the two regions. He said, well, will you send him to my brothers and tell them what has happened so they will repent and they won't come to where I am in this situation? And Abraham says to him, no, we can't do that, they said, because even if someone goes from the dead, they will not believe. They will not believe because they're using their physical eyes and they're using their physical ears, and they're using the other senses of their bodies to try to understand spiritual truth. And they can't do that. When we hear the words of God, when we hear the Old Testament and the New being expressed, the Spirit within us reacts to what we are hearing. The Spirit within us speaks to us and assures us that these are the words of God. It almost shows it to us in a way that we can understand. If people are blind, if they're deaf, you cannot really speak about the world around them, and you cannot speak about the sounds they should be hearing. They don't have the ability to see, and they don't have the ability to hear. We must pray that God will move in such a way that you'll open people's ears and open their eyes, that they will see the truth, and that they will hear the truth and be able to respond to the truth and accept Jesus as their Savior and Lord. So we have these two things. We have Jesus cleansing the temple and showing he has authority over the temple. And then when he's challenged, he says to the people, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. Not speaking about the physical temple, but his body. And then saying to Nicodemus as well, if and when you are born again, you will truly be able to see the kingdom. You will not then be using your eyes or your ears to try to understand it, because the Spirit will show you the truth of what you're seeing and hearing. Amen.